Alright, you guys, so I finished my edition. I printed my 5 prints. One thing you're going to find is that you might have to print more than 5. That's really normal. When I was in undergrad, they always told us to expect a loss rate of about 20%. So for every 10 prints I made, I would lose 2. You know, they just weren't good enough for whatever reason. So if you're printing 5, that means you might have to print 6 to get 5 good ones. And I'm going to show you guys my prints, and I'm going to talk about them in just a minute. But I wanted to show you guys how to clean up first and mention a couple tips. So one thing I found is I have a fan running during my demo because it's so hot outside in my studio that my ink was drying kind of quick. So I just needed, as soon as I got the ink on the board, you know, on my Collograph plate, I needed to put the paper on there, and I needed to, you know, just like start spooning it right away. I didn't put the paper on and leave it for a couple minutes and come back to it or anything like that. You got to just like, once you're going, you got to keep rolling when you're in the middle of a print. Now, if I print 3, but then I have an assignment I have to go turn in for another class and I'm going to take a break, that's okay, because this ink is acrylic, like I mentioned earlier, so it's super easy to clean up compared to oil-based inks. You don't need any solvents. We just need some water, paper towel, sponge, rag, stuff like that. You know, your choice, so to speak. So to, you know, just yeah. And grab my little cleaning sponge, and I'm going to just go ahead and clean up on the wax paper, because the wax paper tend to be disposable. And since we sealed that block, it should just wipe off with a little bit of water and a tiny bit of elbow grease. And you can see that's just coming right off onto the sponge, also onto my fingers. But like I said, it's just acrylic, it's just water-based. Obviously, you could use just paper towels for this, wet and dry. You know, wet paper towels to start, and then dry ones to kind of finish up. You don't necessarily need to get the block perfectly clean, but I would say get it clean enough that you don't have any ink like drying in crevices and filling them in case you need to go back and print more. Because what I do as a teacher is, if you turn in something and I tell you there's something wrong with it, I accept late work, you know, where you go back and reprint it or go back and rework something to get a better result. Because the learning is more important to me than you getting it right the first time. So again, this is like just a cheap kitchen sponge, cellulose sponge. I'm not using this, it's got a scrubby side, I'm not even using that. I'm just using the soft spongy side. Sometimes the blocks, Collograph and etching plates and wood blocks become kind of cool objects outside of being a matrix for making a print. I've sold plates and blocks multiple times to people who not only wanted the print, but they actually wanted the matrix that made the print. So it's just something to kind of be aware of, that it's nice to have a surface. And I could get that a little bit cleaner. I might take it to my sink and do that. But for now, I got most of it off of there, and I got enough that it's not going to like dry and fill in areas and mess up the block if I need to print it later. Plexiglass, I'm just going to go ahead and untape that. I like to save my masking or painter's tape and use it again if I can. Stuff is not cheap. Alright, so same thing, just wet sponge. Baby wipes work really well for this. I think if you watch the Mike McGovern video that I share with you guys in the assignments on Canvas or in the handouts, or there's a link in the handouts as well, or handout. I believe he uses baby wipes for cleanup. And I do sometimes too if I have them around. And I want to make sure I get, you know, the ink off the brayer as well. And like I said, just going to be water. And if I get it mostly clean now, then I can always, you know, walk over to a sink or take it to a garden hose and give it a good final rinse. And the brayer I want to get clean. If I ever print with color, I don't want black on here to stain that color. Unfortunately, the brayer is kind of like the same kind of rubber that erasers are made out of, so it's always going to absorb a little bit of tone. It's never going to look brand new again, but I do want to get as much off of there as possible right away. And then, like I said, once it's been diluted in water, it's easier to wash the rest of it off. If I let it dry on there overnight, it becomes kind of permanent. And what I do for rags is I just take old t-shirts and I cut the sleeves off of them and then cut the bodies into sort of squares and have those around in a little paint bucket. As my shop rags. All right, so that's my sort of initial clean. The plexi is probably clean enough to roll with my next print. Wax paper can just get peeled up and thrown away. I am going to take my brayer to the sink and wash it off a little bit more when I rinse out the paint in my sponge. So if you're using an indoor sink, none of this is toxic or anything like that. It can go into the water, but you want to make sure that all of the ink is, completely dissolved in the water. That you're not getting like dried or thick chunks of acrylic that will then dry and clog the plumbing. If you have a washout basin in your washroom or in the garage, that's probably better, for as far as like staining stuff and making a mess in your apartment or house or whatever. But again, this can be washed in just like a kitchen sink, or I use my bathtub sometimes just to kind of rinse everything out, make sure it all goes down the drain. All right, thank you very much. I'll show you my prints in just a sec. All right, guys, here's my edition. So I laid out the prints in order of printing them. And you can see just at a cursory glance how much lighter that first print is. And like I said, usually it takes a little while to get the block. It gets easier to print as you go along because there's more ink left on the block. It gets easier to print them darker. They print darker just in general. If I preferred this lighter print, what I could have done is just wiped my block down between each print and dried it off with paper towels, and then just kept printing them, and all of them would have been that way. But with a Collograph, and again, this being your first relief print, it's all right if they get a little progressively, darker, or they change a little bit over time. But I did lose some of that detail of the drawing that I did with the glue in the background as it sort of filled in. Now it's still there in the dark parts. You can still see some of that detail, but it just kind of blends in a little bit. So like I said, one thing I could have done, just as like a teaching moment, is I could have cleaned off my block between each print. But yeah, there's my edition of 5, and we're all done.